Welcome to the CEC Report. It's September 16th and I'm Robert Barwick. I'm joined again by CEC Leader and National Secretary Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Robbie.
All right, today we have an explosive 9/11 update. We're going to discuss how the government finds only protectionism can save shipping, so they should apply it to all industries. And our final subject is Charles follows Philip into the genocide business. So first, we have an explosive 9/11 update. Following on from last week's 10th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, we promoted on this program the LaRouche Political Action Committee documentary called 10 Years Later. And if you've watched that, you know that the Saudi and British governments are both complicit in the 9/11 attacks, and their complicity has been covered up by both the Bush and now Obama administrations. Well, since the anniversary this week, a Lloyd's of London insurance portfolio called Lloyd's Syndicate 3500 has filed a lawsuit in the US state of Pennsylvania against the Saudi government, or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, a few Saudi charities and 2 Saudi banks. And this lawsuit seeks compensation for the $215 million that this syndicate paid out in insurance claims to 9/11 victims. And they're seeking this compensation on the basis that the terrorist attacks were only possible because of Saudi logistical support. Now, we're putting out a release on this today. I'm going to read you one section from that. The Lloyd's suit was premised on the argument that while the costs of the 9/11 attack per se were limited, Al-Qaeda had a $35 million a year budget that was largely covered by payments from the Saudi royal family and allied circles. The suit provided very detailed allegations about the role of the Saudi regime in sponsoring, financing and supporting Al-Qaeda over the 13-year period from 1988 through to the 11th of September 2001 attacks. The evidence compiled for the lawsuit was based almost exclusively on US and Saudi government documents, including publicly available evidence provided by scores of Guantanamo Bay detainees who were picked up as enemy combatants and who were affiliated with either Al-Qaeda or the Saudi charities named in the suit. And then we go on to name some of these that are mentioned in the lawsuit. So this is a very explosive development. Now, I have to say, this lawsuit does not deal with the British role in this, just the Saudi, and we can talk about that. But the fact that it's happening, Craig, wouldn't this indicate that despite all the efforts to cover up the Saudi role, powerful circles, such as represented in Lloyd's of London, know that what EIR exposed in this documentary is true?
Well, it's not only true, Robbie, but this video has a very important strategic role to play. And what Mr. LaRouche said, that it had the chance, it had the possibility of changing the view of, changing the mentality of large sections of the US population. And if Australians watch it too, I think they'll see that the same effect on us. Because look, instead of the terror issue or the economic issue being at the forefront, what Mr. LaRouche says is this documentary goes through the strategic warfare element of what 9/11 meant, and for what the American population has been subjected to, and the Australian population has been subject to for the last 10 years. Look, the point is that after 9/11 here in Australia, as we went through last week on this show, you know, John Howard started bringing in a raft of legislation, some 28 different laws between 2000 and 2004, to specifically deal with this so-called terrorist threat. Now, these were aimed specifically to take away the civil liberties of Australians, and they were designed not against terrorism, but against our own people, right?
And they're so draconian, they would never, ever have been accepted were it not for 9/11.
And that's the mentality that was changed, yeah. Like the shock front that took place in Germany when Hitler burnt down the Reichstag, which we go through. You know, people say Hitler did that. Well, no, elements behind that supported him created a psychological shock front that he could be brought to power and bring in legislation which previously would never be thought of. That's what's happened here in Australia. Now, we campaigned on this. We had the End Them, Don't Amend Them campaign where we ran full-page articles, which we went through last week. But the intent, though, was to deal with the potential of the uprising of the Australian population in the case of what's happening right now, the collapse of the global financial system. To bring in laws that may not necessarily be used straight away, but are there. You know, these laws are, for example, the ability of the army to deploy against Australian citizens. That was never the case before these laws came in. The ability of the
Well, just on that particular one, if Australia witnessed what is happening on a daily basis in Greece right now, for example, we have laws that could allow the government to cite the threat of terrorism and bring in the army and clear the streets.
That's right. And most people don't realise this. These things have been sort of snuck in. They're not necessarily used at the moment, but they're there. The Attorney General, right, has the power to ban whatever organisation he or she likes. ASIO has new detention powers previous to this whole period, which are pretty draconian, like 48 hours without even just disappearing people.
You can disappear people off the street. Yep.
Yeah, just disappear people. Wider wiretapping powers without having to get assent from judges and so forth.
People can be charged without hearing the evidence against them.
That's right, and then the point is that all of these have been passed, and they're just sitting there now, and this is all a result of 9/11.
Also, none of these laws in the actual legislation say Muslim.
No.
The Australian people have to understand that. The climate that was whipped up.
They couldn't, under Australian law, they couldn't discriminate against one different group.
Of course. So that the target can be a trade unionist or any kind of political activist, etc. They're not specific to any kind of sense of terrorism that is in the mind of the people, that is.
Yeah, well, Hitler didn't go after just the Jews. He went after the gypsies, the trade unionists, anyone that opposed a threat to his establishment. Well, that's the sort of fascism we're talking about today. But there's another very important thing which this video gets into, and what's been shown up by the involvement of the Saudis, and that's what people don't realise, is that this type of terrorism, like 9/11 type terrorism, is always state-sponsored. It's not some small little group that just does it, but it's coordinated top-down. Now, who are these states? Well, what this lawsuit shows is that the Saudi state itself was involved. What we know and what we discussed last week is that you have this Al Yamama deal, this oil for arms deal with $80 billion so-called of deals between the sale of British arms to the Saudi Arabians in exchange for, I think it's 600,000 barrels of oil per day being shipped back and marketed via Royal Dutch Shell and Shell Oil and BP, right? Which created a huge slush fund for being able to fund covert activities right throughout the world, including terrorism. That's the British role in this, which we've exposed, which EIR has exposed very, very precisely in the latest 10 years later video. And then you think about the United States. Well, how could these planes fly into the World Trade Center? And as Mr. LaRouche made very clear on the Jack Stockwell program, as this event was occurring, this could not have been done without some sort of complicity at the high levels of the military or within the administration. Not George Bush per se, obviously he wouldn't be capable of that. But where you're talking about these types of terrorism aspects, you have to look at what states, what governments, what instrumentalities of government are involved, and not just look at these little puppet organisations. And that's what this idea of strategic warfare is about. Why the attack on the United States? Well, the United States represents the potential of a true republic. It represents the potential of a Rooseveltian type revolution whereby we can overturn the current financial and monetary system, which is in the process of disintegration, which is what we're seeing with the problems with Greece and the other European countries right now. If there is a move back to the sorts of policies that Franklin Roosevelt represented, like the Glass-Steagall, that is a direct threat to the British monetary system. Consequently, any state that represents that potential has to be destroyed, and it has to be destroyed from within. Hence the 9/11, the draft of laws, and so forth. So people should really watch that video on the LPAC site and look at it from the point of view of strategic warfare in the context of what has already taken place in history.
Yep. And just before we go on, as I said earlier, this focuses on the Saudi role, not the British role, and that's probably not surprising given it's a Lloyd's of London lawsuit, but the fact that the Lloyd's is doing that probably ties into what we've already identified and talked about here in the recent past, that there is an enormous factional fight within the broader financial oligarchy about how to deal with the ongoing global financial crisis. So we will monitor this and keep people updated in this forum.
But it's a big breakout to have that come in. It really does open the floodgates to put a spotlight on the truth.
Yep. All right. So let's get on to our second item, which is going to be a very interesting economics discussion. The Australian government has found that only protectionism can save Aussie shipping, so they should apply it to all industries. This week, Infrastructure and Transport Minister Anthony Albanese unveiled a reform package to save Australia's ailing shipping industry. And as he says, this is the way he puts it, this package is to turn Australia from being a shipper nation, a nation which supplies the goods to be transported, to being a shipping nation, i.e. a nation which actually does the transporting as well. Now, before we get into the details, it's important to remember that back in December 1999, when there was a big debate over whether Australia's national shipping line, ANL, should be allowed to continue or supported to continue, the then Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, John Anderson, who was the head of the National Party and who was also the Transport Minister, and this was at the time when the National Party of Australia were nothing but feral free traders. Now, they've slightly changed since then, partly as a backlash against people like Anderson, but you farmers out there remember what the National Party was and largely still is. Anderson gave a speech to a Melbourne dinner where he announced, quote, "Australia is a shipper nation and not a shipping nation." In other words, we don't need our own transport industry, we'll just supply the raw materials. So by Anthony Albanese saying what he said this week, he's expressing the intention to reverse that. Now, like with Albanese's frequent references to high-speed trains, you have to think that this is probably, typically, just a tease. They talk about this stuff to appeal to their base. In Albanese's case, I'm sure this is relating to pressure from the Maritime Union of Australia, which is fine. But putting that aside, it's instructive to see when you look at the package that they've announced, that their plan, on paper at least, to save shipping amounts to an acknowledgement that the only way it can be done is through protectionism. So, Craig, for the sake of the audience, what is the plan?
Well, I find it rather stark that this has come up, because when I was reading the newspapers, I thought, what is this? Why is this happening? Well, this is happening because the physical economy of Australia is collapsing at such a rate that they are even forced within a free trade environment to have to act on it. And of course, the Australian Maritime Union would be, as part of the Labor Party, speaking very strongly about this, because they represent, a very, very important part of an industry that's crucial for us as an island nation. I mean, why did we have the Australian National Line in the first place? Was because it was bought under them by and through the Commonwealth Bank to be able to control the supplies for World War I for our island nation. So nothing's changed. It's just as crucial. But what's happened in the last few years is that, our industry has declined from 55 ships in 1995 to 22 today, right? Australia accounts...
22 Australian ships.
That's for the whole country, right? Now, people see a lot more ships around, but a majority of them, of course, are foreign-owned. We account for 10% of the world's trade. 10%, just from our country, right? But while 99% of international trade is carried by ships, right, our trade, only 0.5% of that, 0.5% is carried by vessels that are owned and carry the Australian flag, right? What's even worse is that of the 22 ships that we've got, they average 20 years old, which is well above the world's average. The world's average is about 12 years old of the age of the ships. So the other part is that, like in the farming industry, our seafarers, the people that man these ships, are getting very old. I mean, the average age is 45, right? So what Albanese has come out and recognised, or the government's recognises there has to be something done about this. And within the free trade environment, they're saying, okay, we're going to give a 0% company tax to all Australian companies that get involved in developing the shipping industry. In other words,
0%, no tax.
It's 45%, 48% now, 0% tax, no company tax, which is a huge break in terms of providing an incentive for companies to develop, right? There's a few conditions to this. The ships have to be Australian flagged, they have to be based here, they have to be embarking on training new mariners, like there's a maritime college down in Tasmania that's been involved with the discussions and the inquiries that the government's had on this. Obviously they know what to do. And they have to, once they elect to become part of this tax break, they have to stay in it for 10 years. There's no way of getting out, right? They are sort of locked in. And
that's just so there's no tax avoidance. It's not a ploy for tax avoidance.
Yeah, and the other thing which is important is that they're cutting the depreciation rate from 20 years to 10 years. In other words, you can write off the ships faster. I mean, these ships are in salt water, they require a huge amount of maintenance. So by turning them over, by depreciating them faster, you can turn the fleet over faster and have a young fleet.
So whichever way you cut it, and we're not being critical here, this is protectionism.
That's right. It's the government taking an initiative to say, we want to have a shipping industry. We have to act. This is a crisis, and they've acknowledged the crisis. It unfortunately is going to only take place within a free trade environment. It's unlike what we would propose. Now, we've already put out in our Infrastructure New Citizen, the proposal for Australia to have a modern, high-speed shipping industry using, the roll-on, roll-off concept of Incat, which is a Tasmanian company. They had a series of these boats called the Incat's Evolution series, which involved the use of roll-on, roll-off containerism, right? So we can take advantage of the fact that we're very close to the Asian market. So we could increase our potentialities to ship freight up into Asia.
Can I just hold that thought? These particular ships that we're highlighting here, they're not suited for bulk shipments of raw materials, are they?
No, they're not. But no, they're not. But we
will also. We should have our own manufacturing.
Absolutely. Here. I mean, we should have our own, abilities to create our own ships, build our own large tankers and so forth. We can do that. We've got the steel, we've got the know-how. We can do this. It just requires a means of funding it, which is where it's not going to come from this government that relies on the private, monetarist system. This is why we've proposed that we need a Commonwealth National Credit Bank, a national bank, that if we decided we wanted to have a shipbuilding industry, the government could say, okay, we will create the credit necessary to provide for the factories, for the manufacturing facilities, in order to create a fleet of government-owned ships. And that might take, it'll be a 10, 20-year project, but in the long run we will have the ability to produce ships based upon the issuance of credit, not debt, which is how the national banking system operates. I mean, it's a baby step in the right direction by this government, which is there's very, very few of them given all the carbon tax rubbish that they're putting up. But this is a response to the reality that the physical economy is crashing, and we are an island nation, and we're going to get held hostage by foreign powers if we don't have our own means of shipping our own produce.
And the lesson to be learned is because a lot of people out there are concerned about all kinds of different industries, the car industry, the agricultural industries, whatever industry. And the government is giving them platitudes, paying lip service to the fact, we support these industries. But if they're serious, there's no way to save any industry, steel or whatever, without protectionism.
Or a national bank, right? Because and the intention to actually have those industries in the first place, which is what is driving this change in policy.
Okay, finally, let's talk about our favourite subject, the royals. Charles follows Philip.
I don't think it's favourite, Robert.
Oh. Well, sometimes it is. Charles follows Philip into the genocide business. Last week, Prince Charles was announced that as the new president of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, United Kingdom. And as such, he is following in his father's footsteps, who was the very first president of the WWF UK back in 1961. We have exposed that the agenda of this Phillip-led green operation, this green fascist operation, is nothing but genocide, population reduction. That fact is becoming less and less disguised. So back in March, for example, Prince Philip hosted a speech that by Sir David Attenborough to the Royal Society in London. And this speech, if you hear it, and you can listen to it on the internet if you look it up, this speech signalled a definite escalation in the global drive for population reduction. From beginning to end, Sir David Attenborough did what he is a little bit more diplomatic about in his documentaries. He blamed all of the world's populations on too many people. As part of this speech, he conspicuously praised the formation of the World Wildlife Fund in 1961 as the first major body committed to solving the problem. So following the speech, Prince Philip, 90-year-old Prince Philip, sentimentally recounted how the WWF was set up. And he made the point that when it was set up, he had an argument with Sir Peter Scott, one of the other founders, because Sir Peter Scott said that the WWF should promote conservation as a way people could enjoy nature. And Prince Philip said, but I disagreed with that. He said, I told him, we want to conserve nature for its sake, not for humans. If humans are involved, they'll just pursue their own self-interest. Nature has to be preserved for its own sake, not humans. So last week, when Prince Charles took over this job as the new president of the WWF UK, he continued his father's favourite theme, and he ranted in his speech about how many species are currently being driven into extinction by man. Now, in content, what Prince Charles said was a clear reaction to the recent work by Lyndon LaRouche and his basement research team on the great extinction cycles of in the history of the biosphere, the 5 great extinction cycles, the last one of which was the KT extinction 62 million years ago, and how these cycles follow a 63 million year period. Chucky declared that we are in the next great extinction now, and it's all man's fault. So, Craig, there's a few things to say about this, but one thing to start with, isn't blaming man for extinctions today just a rehash of the genocide propaganda of Thomas Malthus and Charles Darwin?
Well, it's funny that Chucky has come back with the extinction cycles, because on the back of our last New Citizen, the one Charles Darwin was a fraud, right? What we talk about is the fact that mankind is subject to these extinction cycles. That, you know, when we've had these extinction cycles, 98% of all living species is just simply wiped out. And these extinction cycles are based upon galactic phenomenon that if we don't, as human beings, develop an understanding of the physical principles that govern the universe, we won't survive, right? But see, the likes of Chucky and Prince Philip, they're not interested and concerned about what's taking place in the galaxy. They're only concerned about the fact that they want to be on the top of the heap. They want to be the gods of Olympus. They want to be the Zeuses of the world. And consequently, if we were to try and educate our population and to have a citizenry that is, you know, profoundly committed to making discoveries, there's no role for them.
That's right.
They're finished. They're extinct, right?
And Chucky said that in his speech. He called himself part of an endangered species, the royalty.
Yeah, well, we put this paper
he knows
out.
we're onto him.
We put this paper out. You know, we put a lot of them out. You know, nearly 300,000 of them gone out around the country, and we've had a lot of criticism from people coming back saying, "You're attacking Darwin. How dare you attack Darwin?" You know, and these people are the people that quote Darwin regularly, but they have no idea who this creep actually was, right? Because Darwin wasn't a man. He was actually a project. And he was a project specifically of cultural warfare run top-down by the Privy Council of the British Crown. And one of the key guys in this initially, running this, was Thomas Huxley, right, who was otherwise known, and we go through this in the paper, as Darwin's bulldog. Thomas Huxley was a Privy Councillor, right? And he too, just like Philip and Chucky, railed against overpopulation, you know. And Huxley used all the assets of the Crown, like particularly the British East India Company, and also another organisation called the X Club, which was created specifically by the British oligarchy to contain all the different elements of science. They had representatives from each of the branches of science in order to control science. Now, Huxley was responsible for developing that particular idea, and this X Club was used to promote Darwin's specific ideas of, you know, evolution and survival of fittest. But see, even that's a fraud, because Darwin didn't invent the idea of evolution. He didn't invent the idea of survival of the fittest. And we go through in our next paper, which is coming out in a couple of weeks' time, exactly what these frauds are. I won't go through them now because we don't have the time. But one of the more important aspects of these frauds I can mention is that Darwin was simply a rehash of Thomas Malthus, the employee of the British East India Company, specifically in economy at the point, right, who again put forward the dogmas of the world's overpopulated, and, you know, he put forward all sorts of ideas of how we should reduce the world's population. But the reason I mention this is because Philip and Charles are part of the Crown. They're part of the Privy Council. They're part of this apparatus that has always been fighting for population reduction. And
yeah, always. So back, how many people were around when Malthus was saying we're overpopulated? 1 billion, barely 1 billion maybe. So now there's 7 billion. They're using the same arguments for 7 billion as they used for 1 billion. It wasn't right then, and it's not right now.
Right. And see, one of the, because I am working on the next New Citizen, one of the stunning quotes that we have in the New Citizen, which I want to draw people's attention to, is this idea that, you know, Darwin wasn't a eugenicist, he wasn't a genocidalist. Well, this is what he says, and I put up this this graphic of Australia's mortality rate in the 1900s.
Infant mortality.
Infant mortality rate. In 1901, there was 111.4 deaths of infants per 1,000 live-born infants, right? And then that's dropped down to 4.7. And this is what Darwin says about this graph. He says, the greater death rate of infants in the poorest classes is also very important, as well as the greater mortality from various diseases of the inhabitants of crowded and miserable houses at all ages. He then goes on to re-quote Malthus and says that Malthus has discussed these several checks like wars and famines, but he does not lay stress enough on what is probably the most important of all, namely infanticide, especially of female infants, and the habit of procuring abortion. Licentiousness may also be added to the foregoing checks.
Checks, by checks, it means checks on population growth.
That's right. Right, so therefore, one can only include that Darwin would like to see the infant mortality rate go up from 4.7 to 111.4. This is Darwin we're talking about. This is not the sweet Darwin of evolution. This is the eugenicist guy.
And in fact, anyone today who decries population growth, who says that the population explosion, so-called, is the greatest problem and crisis ever, what they're decrying is the drop in infant mortality, because that's where the population growth has come from. We've improved our medical facilities and our standards of living, and that's what's allowed the population to grow, and that's what they're unhappy about.
Exactly right. I mean, this is what people don't understand about Darwin. Darwin was a project of the Privy Council, right? And he was a creation specifically against population development. And this is what Prince Charles and Prince Philip are just restating right now. And there's no accident that, you know, Prince, and we use this cartoon a fair bit, that Julian Huxley, right, the then president of the Eugenics Society, Julian Huxley was the grandson of Thomas Huxley, Prince Philip himself, and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, of which I believe in that speech, you know, Prince Philip referred to the founding of the World Wildlife Fund, all founded the World Wildlife Fund as a funding mechanism for various institutions, green institutions around the world. Now, you can step, as we go through the paper, you know, Julian Huxley was not just some figure picked out of the blue. I mean, this guy was part of the nexus of H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, who are both co-founders of the Fabian Society.
Julia Gillard's Fabian Society.
Julia Gillard's Fabian Society. So this, and also Kelvin Thompson. Don't forget Kelvin. Kill him, right? They founded the Fabian Society against what the what the American Revolution meant under Lincoln and the development of the American economy under Lincoln. And so, of course, here's Julian Huxley too. He's part of this trio that are regarded as the founders of modern environmentalism. And there's some others, but we'll go through that more in the paper. So when we talk about Prince Philip, Prince Charles, it's all one incestuous group that believe in the issue is population reduction.
Yep. All right, well, I think we're pretty much running out of time, so thanks for that, Craig. That'll do for this week's CEC report. As I said, we will follow the developments on the Lloyd's lawsuit closely. We're also about to, in the next few weeks, launch a very explosive expose of the whole green movement in Australia, of which you've seen some of the material here, so wait for that. And also, I'll just mention quickly, as we speak, Greece is about to default on its debt. So everything that we've been saying about that is coming true as well. So we will have reports on that in the coming weeks. So thanks for tuning in, and tune in to next week's CEC report.